Could you also work No, not Catherine, not Catherine. Cicely, could you go up with me? Just because there's actually going to be... Yeah, just because there's actually going to be... I think this is going to be... Let's do something like that. Because Margaret's going to be on the first floor anyway, and if y'all end up bunching up, it'll give you still more. Okay, so let's practice walking off. Margaret will be first, Nance will be next, you will be next. Now you follow her, yes. You still follow her. Then you follow her. And then you just gotta be ready to come on. How do you catch my eye? I usually give you the cue, like say go. But do you need me to look you in the eye? No, I know. Maybe I'm not getting the inner workings of the church, so maybe what you say. What did she say?
Good morning. I'm Reverend Joanna. Welcome home. Unitarian Universalism is unambiguously, unapologetically progressive. This church affirms the inherent worth and dignity of all people through anti-racism, anti-oppression, supporting the LGBTQIA+ community, working for reproductive justice, voting rights, and other issues as needed. And since the Texas Ledge is back in town, there will be other issues as needed. We seek to build beloved community not only here but out in our surrounding area as well, and we bring a spirit of joy to it all. It is so good to be together this morning. Would you please rise either in body or in spirit for our opening hymn, Joyful, Joyful, We Adore Thee.
Welcome to Live Oak Unitarian Universalist Church. My name is Barbara Coldiron, and the one thing I love about Live Oak is the chalice lighting. I'd like to welcome any guests we have today. If this is your first time here, please stop at our visitors table so we can meet you and answer any questions that you might have. As part of our mission, we want to enhance the connections between each of us and also with the outside world. You can stay connected with everything happening at Live Oak through our weekly email newsletter. There's a link on our homepage. And during this worship service, no need to put your phone away. We encourage you to post on social media things you hear today, maybe even an invitation for a friend to join us next week. Today, our chalice at Live Oak is being lit by Teddy Van Winkle. And now, here and at home, let us light our chalices with these words. Uh-oh. It went out. Blessed are you, weaver of being, who shaped the human being with wisdom, making for us all the openings and vessels of the body. It is known that we are miracles, and all bodies are miracles. This is a congregation bound not by creed, but by covenant. May those in agreement affirm this covenant now. We affirm a caring community of and for all ages, seeking wisdom, doing service, and living with integrity. In our diversity, our covenant holds us in unity as we celebrate our shared spiritual journey.
A special part of Unitarian Universalist Sunday services is our time of sharing joys and sorrows. I think of it as the time when we keep vigil for one another, when we give one another the gift of being present to those among us who have had some special milestone in their personal lives during the previous week, or some particular joy or sorrow that it's important for the congregation to know. And I know that one joy many people are holding is that yesterday was our Texas UU Justice Ministry's 10th anniversary, and there was a big celebration and many speakers with that. Often what is heavy on our hearts are our own fears that we have fallen short. We know that we have left undone those things which we ought to have done, and we have done those things which we ought not to have done. May we have the courage to be honest with ourselves, the willingness to make amends, and the compassion to accept forgiveness from others and from ourselves, trusting in the assurance that imperfection is expected, and love is the guiding and healing force with which we can align our lives.
Good morning. I'm Chris German, and I serve as Director of Lifespan Faith Development. And I would like to invite I'm going to surrender the wandering time to Apollo and Oliver. And they are going to share not a story, a lesson with us today. Thank you, Oliver and Apollo.
We also invite the youth of the congregation to join us up front.
We got people on.
Oh. Never mind. Leave.
Hey, Oliver,
Yeah.
Dad is getting you a mic.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. We have a story to tell you today that is completely true and is about Unitarian Universalists.
UUs have a really long history of giving young people leadership roles and paying attention to their voices.
In fact, the youth organizations of both Unitarian and Universalist churches had a big role to play in how the two churches merged.
Young people in both religions were getting more involved in the 1880s and 1890s. But at the time, the only kind of activities most churches offered for teens and young adults were dances, teas, and other social gatherings. Lots of young people wanted more from their religion than just social events, and they wanted to show that they had more to give too.
So, in 1889, the Young People's Christian Union of the Universalist Church was founded, connecting lots of different churches' youth groups with a focus on what they could do together on a much bigger scale.
There were a few different Unitarian youth groups at the time, but in 1896, they came together into one organization and named the Young People's Religious Union.
One of the first projects of the YPCU, the Universalist version of YPRU, and YPRU took on together was to build a new Universalist church in Harriman, Tennessee. The Unitarian youth helped the Universalists raise the money and built the church in just 2 years.
They held rallies together too. They called them uni rallies. People had a lot of fun. They felt connected to each other and their religion, and both groups were growing and getting stronger as the 20th century began.
One thing you should know about both these national organizations for young people is that that time they meant people under 35. So in the beginning, a lot of the leadership in the YPRU and the YPCU were in their 20s and 30s. But as the organizations grew stronger, younger and younger people got involved, and teenagers started having a voice in the group too.
One of the big steps towards building a culture and a community was weekend conferences, or cons. The first Unitarian Youth Conference was held in 1921 at the Isles of Shoals. The Young People's Religious Union put it on. Those are the Unitarians. In the 1920s, weekend conferences and week-long camps, hugely important gatherings for groups all over the East Coast to connect, make friends, make plans, share ideas, and have fun.
Camps and cons were so much fun. Youth still put them on today. Many of the retreat centers on the East Coast hosted these big gatherings are still UU camps today. Star Island, Murray Grove, Ferry Beach. And they have a long history of building culture and community and spirituality. In fact, some youth from this church actually still go to UU camps in the summer.
Unfortunately, things got a lot harder for the YPRU and the YPCU when the stock market crashed in 1929 and the Great Depression began in America. During the 1930s, a lot of people didn't have jobs, or they weren't making very much money, and it was a lot harder for them to support their church.
And in the days before email and conference calls, when there was no money to send to a delegate to a conference or a board meeting, it got a lot harder for leaders to keep running big organizations spread out across the country.
So of course they did what UUs do when things get hard. They make a new acronym. It's more than that, I promise, but it's a new acronym. In 1942, the Young People's Religious Union met with the American Unitarian Association, and they voted to change their name to American Unitarian Youth. They voted on some other changes too, like to the budget, and to focus on serving high school and college-aged people.
And the Universalists did something pretty similar. The Young People's Christian Union voted to change their name to the Universalist Youth Fellowship in 1941. All of this reorganization happened right before America entered World War II, and a lot of members of the UIF and the AUY went overseas to fight in the war.
For a lot of youth at the time, having friends drafted to serve as soldiers was very scary, but it brought them closer to their church and their youth group. It brought the Unitarians and Universalists closer together too. The AUY and the UYF even started publishing a magazine together in 1945 called The Young Liberal to help all their members stay connected.
In 1949, both groups voted to start figuring out how to merge into one great big youth organization. So of course, they formed a committee, because that's how UUs do things. And that Joint Relations Committee presented its reports 2 years later at a big conference in the summer of 1951, where they formed a personnel committee and appointed a youth-adult committee. They wrote it into their rules that the committee had to have an equal number of youth and adults so they could be sure that teenagers had a voice.
It took 2 more years after all the committees and reports and bylaws, revisions, and delegates to come together in 1953 for the American Unitarian Youth and Universalist Youth Fellowship Joint Convention at Hanover College in Hanover, Indiana. All those high school and college students got together and discussed and debated and reviewed the bylaws for 7 hours straight. before they finally took a vote, but in the end, the overwhelming majority of members voted to merge, and the Liberal Religious Youth was born.
A year later, the American Unitarian Association and the Universalist Church of America had a joint meeting in Massachusetts, and a delegation of 40 members of the new Liberal Religious Youth organization attended to give a presentation on their merger process and how they had done it so thoughtfully and so democratically. They proved to both denominations that not only was a merger possible, it was probably the smart thing to do.
And they were right, of course. It took the adults a few more years, so much so, the youth that we mentioned actually became a part of the adults. In 1961, the Unitarians and the Universalists voted to use their prior knowledge of merging youth groups before and joined together to form the Unitarian Universalist Association.
So now you know how important young people's ideas are in our religion. It's part of where we came from. And we think... Okay, 3. And we think that's pretty neat.
Thank you so much. And just to let you know, I joined Liberal Religious Youth, LRY, in the mid-'60s. That saved my life. And now would you please rise in body or in spirit for hymn 113, Where is Our Holy Church?
Outwitted by poet and universalist Edwin Markham. He drew a circle that shut me out. Heretic, rebel, a thing to flout. But love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle that took him in.
Each of us has a
How did we get from there to here? How did we get from being two Christian denominations in the 1800s to the open, pluralist, free faith where you don't even have to believe in God that we are today? I encounter this sometimes. Sometimes I will run into someone who knows just a little bit about our history and who we are now to think that they know far more than they actually do, right? And so they'll say something like, yes, well, the Unitarians, some of our founding fathers were Unitarians. Yes. But y'all have no relation to them. Wrong. Wrong. People sometimes act as if that was one or two religions and that at some point that just stopped and like we stole the name. As a former marketing person, I can tell you, Unitarian Universalism is not the name that you should steal. You know, it's 10 syllables. No one knows what it means. That's not something to steal. But you got to dance with the ones what brung you. And it was the Unitarians and the Universalists who brought us to where we are today. Unitarian Universalism is and always has been an evolutionary faith. And our evolutionary nature was planted in our DNA at the very beginning. And every step of the evolution of this faith has been predicated by the step before. This faith is an unbroken line. You are in relationship with the earliest Unitarians and Universalists in this country. So, anyone interested in a little bit of history? I hope so, because put on your safety helmets and lower the security bar and keep your hands and feet inside the ride at all times, because we are about to streak through over 200 years of Unitarian Universalist history. We are going to start in the 1700s in what would become the United States with Universalism. Now, Universalism at that time referred to universal salvation. It was the idea that the nature of God was love. And as such, no one would go to an eternal hell. That just wasn't consistent with God being love. And so this was the big and exciting message, because this was during the time of, sinners in the hands of an angry God. And so they wanted to spread this message of love and of reassurance. And there were things that went along just naturally with universalism. If you deeply believe that the force in the universe is one of love, then it naturally falls that we are called to look at everyone, even people who don't think the same way as we do, seeking out love and relationship, and that you will see all of the different cultures and religions of the world not as being a threat to your faith, but as another way of understanding God. And so even from the very beginnings, this was woven in. One of the early Universalist in our country was Dr. George de Benneville. Next month you're going to be hearing more about him, because boy, was he a guy. Anyway, he wrote that in 1777, he said this, "As no church is pure in all things, so none can be found that does not contain some truth." This was in the 1700s. Glorious truths are found in every church and religion under the sun. You can read the rest there. So then George de Benneville, along with some others, went on to help form the Universalists in this country into a formal, organized denomination. And so what they needed to do is to differentiate themselves from the other Christians. They needed to have some kind of statement of belief. And we talk all the time, right, about how we're non-creedal, and yet when we meet someone, even today, what is it that they want to know? What do you believe, right? So the Universalists came up with a very simple, it's not up here, is like 3 points of universalism called the Winchester Profession about the nature of God and about universal salvation. But then they included, almost as long as the faith statements themselves, the Liberty Clause, which basically is saying, okay, here's what we kind of all agree on, and yet we don't want to be constrained by that, and we really believe that every person and every congregation has the right to be open to further understandings. And the Liberty Clause would remain a part of universalism, other than for a small time at the end of the 1800s. They always had some version of the Liberty Clause in their faith statements. Now, just a half a step behind, you had the Unitarians who were forming themselves into a denomination. And that wasn't the immediate goal. So, with some exception, the Unitarians were coming out of the Congregationalist, or actually they weren't coming out, they were part of the Congregationalist tradition, which some of you know came from the Puritans. How ironic is that we came from the Puritans? I could preach a whole sermon about how some of it is still with us, but not today. And so they actually didn't want to start a new denomination. Their hope, they were the liberal Christians, and then you had the Orthodox Christians coming out of Congregationalism, and their hope was, look, that we can all stay together. It's just that we'll have, an openness to the fact that we don't all think alike. Well, the thing with orthodoxy, that's kind of against the whole point of orthodoxy. And so they kept pushing on these liberal Christians, insulting them, calling them Unitarians, which was a huge slur. And so William Ellery Channing, there was an article that was put out into a journal called The Panopticist, talking about these Unitarians, that they weren't real Christians. And he responded to that. And he talked about, let us be what we profess to be, patient inquirers after truth, open to conviction, willing to listen to objection, willing to renounce error. So this is before the Unitarians have even formed themselves as a denomination. And they already are putting this out there that part of being who they are is to be open. They didn't use the word evolution, but it's to be open to theological evolution. And it would be 4 years later that William Ellery Channing stood up in a pulpit and delivered, we've talked about this sometimes before, the sermon, Unitarian Christianity, where he basically says, okay, fine, you want to call us Unitarians? We're Unitarians, and here is what that means. But from the very beginning, it was, we are going to leave this open for new beliefs and new understandings. So that evolutionary nature would continue. Unitarian, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Did anyone read Divinity School Address when you were in high school? Some of us of a certain age. I know that was, and they called it Divinity School Address, but the actual name of this talk that he gave was Acquaint Thyself Firsthand with Deity. Very controversial, very world-rocking, because what he said was, you don't have to believe in these scriptural miracles. You can have a relationship directly with the divine, and you can trust your own moral intuition. So you see, we're breaking away from the idea that the Bible is the definitive authority that we have to move to. And right after that, one of his other transcendentalist peers was Theodore Parker. And in 1841, Theodore Parker gave this sermon that rocked our Unitarian world, called The Transient and the Permanent in Christianity, where he went through and he said, there are some truths in Christianity that are timeless, that are permanent. But there's also a lot of things in Christianity that they only speak to a particular time and a particular set of circumstances. And those are transient. We don't have to take those things with us. And in that sermon, this is a quote I want you to sit with, I want you to be awed by this. This is 1841. It is hard to see why the great truths of Christianity rest on the personal authority of Jesus more than the axioms of geometry rest on the personal authority of Euclid or Archimedes. Right? What's he saying here? He's saying you can have what is most important in Christianity without having Christ. That was go into a Christian church, not even a fundamentalist church. Go into a mainstream Christian church right now and say this. I think they will very politely show you the door, right? Well, in 1841, it was certainly very controversial, and he was shown the door. Many of his Unitarian colleagues ostracized him. He wasn't allowed in many pulpits, and yet that wisdom that he spoke of would continue to influence the movement of our religious history. So I'm going to cross the pond briefly because I do think it's important to know that at this time, the Enlightenment thinking was not just affecting, of course, the United States. And you had Unitarians in England, and they were influencing American Unitarians, and American Unitarians were influencing them. And this minister in particular, James Martineau, he was so committed to what we would call non-creedalism and not having doctrine and being open to our religion to continue to evolve, that he even was against us using the name Unitarian, because that was a doctrinal position. And he said, even just that, this alone is enough to check the spontaneous course of gradual change. And he didn't even think that we should say that we were a Unitarian church. And sometimes I wonder if he might not have really been kind of onto something there. 1866, James Freeman Clarke, one of my absolute favorite Unitarians, he was not a fire starter the way that, say, Theodore Parker was, which is probably why I relate to him. He could see that there was still some good stuff, in more Orthodox Christianity. He wrote a book called Orthodoxy on its truths and errors. And in it, he said this: we think it possible to have a church and even a denomination organized not on a creed, but on a purpose of working together. Suppose that the condition of membership was the desire and intention of getting good and doing good. And so you see right here, he's moving away from the idea of beliefs being something that unites us, and instead it being action. And I will tell you, we talk sometimes about our elevator speech, about what we say when someone's like, what is Unitarian Universalism? I use this. I say Unitarian Universalism brings people together to get good and do good. It's from 1866, and I absolutely think that it sums up our purpose today. He went on to, he believed in what he was saying about expanding and being willing to explore other religions in pursuit of getting good and doing good. And so he wrote the book, 10 Great Religions, where he was exploring, comparative, it was comparative religion, but not what had already been done, which was, and here's why all of these are wrong and Christianity is the answer. So, 1875, this guy, Jenkins Lloyd Jones. Now, the evolution of Unitarianism and Universalism has not just been in terms of beliefs, but it has also been the boring organizational stuff. Just like when I, 15 years ago, the Unitarian Universalist churches were organized by districts. We are now have changed to be organized by regions. So that has happened throughout our history too. And we had one conference called the Western Unitarian Conference. Jenkins Lloyd Jones believed that what Unitarian churches should orient themselves around and be known for was not Christianity, but what he called the ethical basis. So even in 1875, you see this pulling away. Yes, Christianity was what we came from, and the values of Christianity were still paramount, but it did not have to be specifically Christian. And he was a leader in the Western Unitarian Conference. They came up with this document about things commonly believed among us. This is also one of the things in our history, which is, like we write these things and we're like, it's not a creed, like the 7 principles. They're not a creed, but there are some things that we all kind of agree with, because that is also a part of who we are. And so one of the things, parse this out, look at this closely. One of the things that they wrote out, because this was to spread this message of who are Unitarians, what are Unitarians? We honor the Bible and all inspiring scripture, old and new. So they are putting out the word that, yes, we honor the Bible, that's our roots, but we're also open both to what else is out there and what is to come. Now, Jenkins Lloyd Jones, this was something deep and personal for him. And so in 1893, at the Chicago World's Fair, you had the first Parliament of World Religions. Do we have anyone here today that has been to any of the Parliament of World Religions? Yes. Donna and I were at the same one in Salt Lake City a few years ago. There's going to be, it happens all over the world every 6 years. Is that what it's at, like that? Anyway, there's going to be another one this August in Chicago. And you actually, you may want to do your vacation there. It's pretty amazing. But this was the first one. And he was the executive secretary, and so this was this amazing event at the World's Fair of bringing not just Christians, but, bringing people from Islam and Judaism, all these different things together, so that for the first time, people could see these representatives of all these different religions, which really affected, because we had a leader who was one of the leaders of this program. It influenced Unitarianism to be open to these different things. Okay, so now, until this point, this was still, when I talk about an unbroken line, don't think of it as a straight line. It was definitely a whole lot of spiraling lines, because as I mentioned with Parker, every step up until then was pretty darn controversial among the Unitarians and among even the Universalists with what they were doing at the same time. Where I believe the tipping point occurred was this, and that was in 1933, it was called a humanist manifesto, the idea that there would be further ones, and there were. And they laid out the tenets of a religion that did not require God. They were not starting a new denomination. There were, I believe, 15 of the signers of the Humanist Manifesto were Unitarians. One was a Universalist. But it just laid out in very clear detail the idea that you could have a religion that was centered on human capability and human morality and what we could do, what we could make happen in the world, and it did not require God. And then just 3 years after that, we have this thing called, and we still have it today, called the Commission of Appraisal in Unitarian Universalism. This was in the Unitarians. And it's where they study usually some issue and what is happening in the movement of our religion at that time. And they released this report called Unitarians Face a New Age. Remember, this is 3 years after the Humanist Manifesto. And they had a longer list than this about here's the things Unitarians agree on, here is what they still disagree on. In terms of what they agreed on, it was in affirming the primacy of the free exercise of intelligence in religion. Just like the Universalists with their Liberty Clause, the Unitarians were all agreed on, okay, we may disagree on some things, but what we agree on is kind of the right to disagree, the right to determine things for our own selves. And this was a switch. They disagreed on should they remain Christian or not. So this is where you're in one of those liminal spaces. They had been Christian. They were now saying you don't have to be, but should that still be the root of who we are? So, someone y'all have heard a lot about, James Luther Adams. So he is the person that I consider to be the most influential theologian of the 20th century. And he was with us past merger, so I call him a Unitarian Universalist, but he started in the Unitarian camp. And, okay, number one, he's not really good with, like, quick sound bites. Many of the complex thinkers are not, right? But this 1939 is where he said this. He's laying out, when he says liberalism, he's talking about religious liberalism. And he's beginning to lay out what are the tenets of it now that we do have this openness. And one of the key issues that we now consider to be one of 5, what we call the smooth stones of religious liberalism, was this, that revelation is continuous. So he is going back to the idea planted in our early DNA and reinforcing it that this is an evolving religion, that the evolutionary nature of our faith is key to who we are. Okay, now I've been talking a lot about Unitarians. Let me go back a little bit to the Universalists. And these are some of my heroes. So the Universalists had, until, they were affected by the Humanist Manifesto as well, but more so than the Unitarians, they were staying pretty Christian. Because again, the whole idea of universal salvation and God being love, is pretty connected to those Christian ideals. So you had this group of young Turk Universalist ministers. Tongue-in-cheek, they called themselves the Humiliati, which means the humble ones. And from everyone who knows them at the time, they weren't at all. Which, you kind of had to have some confidence to stand up and say, we think this should change. You got to have a little chutzpah, right? And so they presented the idea of emergent universalism, of moving past the idea of universalism being about universal salvation, and instead widening to be about the universalism of all people and all kinds of religious thought. They were the ones that created this symbol. And what is important about this symbol is that the cross is not in the center. It is offset to the side to say we are leaving all this room for new revelation. And they had this idea that universalism could be a higher development of world religion that understood that the universe transcends the partialisms of every religious faith, including Christianity. We weren't talking at this time, this is the 40s, and so we're not talking about religious appropriation yet and things like that. So I will say there's a little bit of arrogance in this. They really had hopes for the fact that this symbol, that you would have a version of this with a Star of David, you would have a version of this with other religious symbols there, that they would all be universalist. And yet at the same time, that does kind of point to who we are now. Okay, 1949. You have he had started as a Unitarian minister, Kenneth Patton, and then he was asked by the Universalists to come set up this very experimental church called the Charles Street Meeting House. And it was this idea of having this more expanded universalism. That is a picture from the church, and yes, that is the Andromeda Galaxy that you see that I believe he actually painted, and people were struck by this when they would walk in, and this was the picture of the divine, right? This is how they were seeing that. And then what you can't see there is alongside it, they had all of these brass religious symbols, kind of like our things over here, bringing in different religious symbols into the church or the temple as he thought of it. Again, in history, we simply weren't talking about appropriation. There could be some things that you look back on this now and kind of cringe a little bit, but this was a step in our evolution to being the pluralist faith that we are today. And he had a dream that this would be a religion for one world, where we could find the wisdom in all the different world's religions. So, in 1961, what's the big thing that happens? Merger, or actually consolidation, which the wonks will say means a different legal thing, but okay, merger. Anyway, consolidation. When they came together, they had to agree very quickly on a set of principles. It is similar to, but it is not the 7 principles that you know today, because again, we are an evolutionary religion. And 2 of the things, you have the Unitarians and the Universalists, and trying to bring 2 different religious movements together was not easy, but here were 2 of those principles, and that was free and disciplined search for truth, where each person gets to have that freedom, and to cherish and spread the universal truths taught by the great prophets and teachers of humanity in every age and tradition. Or as I sometimes say, yes, we pull wisdom from the Bible, the Bhagavad Gita, and Beyonce. They were not that forward-thinking. As an example of this, in 1987, you have CUPS, which stands for the Covenant of UU Pagans, that was chartered by the Unitarian Universalist Association. And then the pagans would go on to influence who we are now. And so you know how we have the principles and we have the sources? So in 1995, that's when the 6th source was added about one of our sources of inspiration and religious authority is earth-centered traditions. And we continue to evolve. This church in December voted, along with many other UU churches, to add an 8th principle that deals specifically with anti-oppression and anti-racism. And at the same time, you'll be hearing more about this from our religious education director, Chris. We have what is called the Article 2 Commission that is even looking at, okay, do we actually keep principles, or do we evolve beyond that into a covenant that contains the ideas from the principles, but is something even wider? And this church, representatives from this church, and all the UU churches at a General Assembly in the future will be able to vote on that. And so that pluralism that was predicted at the very beginning now has its home in Unitarian Universalism. This is just an example of books that you can find in our library. Buddhist voices in UUism, and Jewish voices, and pagan. I believe I've heard, I'm looking forward to it, that there is in the works a Hindu voices in Unitarian Universalism. You are not part of a new religion. You are a part of a religion that in this country began in the 1700s. There never was a breaking away. We have always been ever expanding, ever evolving. I drew a circle and drew him in. I invite you now, after that race through history, to slow down for a moment. Join me in a time of reflection. This is an excerpt from the essay, The Church That Is Free, by James Luther Adams, who I mentioned. Settle in so that these words can wash over you. Close your eyes if you are comfortable doing so. I call that church free, which enters into covenant with the ground of freedom, that sustaining, judging, transforming power not made with hands. It protests against the idolatry of any human claim to absolute truth or authority. I call that church free, which liberates from bondage to the principalities and power of the world, whether churchly or secular, and which promotes the continuing reformation of its own and other institutions. I call that church free, which in charity promotes freedom and fellowship, seeking unity in diversity. This unity is a potential gift, sought through devotion to the transforming power of creative interchange in generous dialogue, but it will remain unity in diversity. I call that church free, which responds in responsibility to the Spirit that bloweth where it listeth. It invites and engenders liberation from repression and exploitation, whether of nation or economic system, of race or sex or class. It bursts through rigid, cramping inheritance, giving rise to new language, to new forms of cooperation, to new and broader fellowship. I call that church free, which is not bound to the present, which cowers not before the vaunted spirit of the times. It earns and creates a tradition binding together present, past, and future in a living tether, in a continuing covenant and identity, bringing forth treasures both new and old. I call that church free, which is not imprisoned in itself or in a sect. In loyalty to its own historic character and norms, it is open to insight and conscience from every source. I call that church free, which does not cringe in despair, but casting off fear is lured by the divine persuasion to respond in hope to the light that has shone and that still shines in the darkness. Let us hold that for a moment together in sacred stillness. Amen, and blessed be.
We are the tradition of the Free Church. Our church and our community outreach are supported not from an outside source, but from within. Generosity, therefore, is one of the spiritual values we recognize as central to our personal and our institutional well-being. We share what is offered each week with an organization that upholds our Unitarian Universalist values. This month, we are helping to empower the dream of You Are You. They're having some struggles with their well and are needing to dig deeper, and so we need to dig deeper as well. May an offering be received in gratitude and love.
Okay, we have a lot of things going on during the Faith Development Hour and hours today. So first I'm going to say, if you don't catch it all while I'm saying it, on the TV screen in the narthex, there is a graphic where you need to go. I'm going to start with adults. Adults, we are offering Voices of a Movement with Tim Buckley in the adult RE room in 105. It starts promptly. Get your coffee and go right in. It is an incredible program that Tim has been offering us. Second, if you are 5 years old or younger, you go to the nursery with Miss Harmony, and parents, you'll sign them in at our temporary nursery, which is in room 106. Our teens are in the library with who is it today? Marie. With Marie. So you'll go to the library. Right across the hallway from the library is the staircase to go upstairs. And upstairs we have our parent orientation for 4th through 6th grade in room, just going to check, 205, thank you. Our kindergarten through 2nd grade, our parent interest meeting is in room 205. And our RE program for our kids through 1st through 5th grade is in room 206. So we invite you to grab a drink, to say good morning, and head to your classes. Parents, please sign your kids in and accompany them to their spaces and sign them in. Thank you. I can't wait to see you there.
And now, please rise as you are willing and able for our closing hymn, Forward Through the Ages. So the past is important, the present is important, and the future. And next week, I invite you to come back to church and to stay after the service, where you will get to hear about the next 3 months of the future of this church. Specifically, what are the events and things that are going to be happening that you might be interested in. We call this Fed and Informed. It is a potluck. Please bring food. Please bring food. And it'll be happening right after the service next week. May you know joy beyond measure. May you distribute love extravagantly, ever assured that even on the hard days, life is a blessing.
Teddy?
Teddy's gone.
Okay. Yeah. Will Teddy's mom like to extinguish? Let us say these words to each other. we extinguish this chalice flame, daring to carry forward the vision of this free faith, that freedom, reason, and justice will one day prevail in this nation and across the earth. And now, as we depart, we extend and receive the gift of hospitality by taking the first 5 minutes to talk to someone with whom we don't yet know well. May we all know the blessings of friendship and community. Blessed be.